An astronaut or cosmonaut is a person trained by a human spaceflight program to command, pilot, or serve as a crew member of a spacecraft. While generally reserved for professional space travelers, the terms are sometimes applied to anyone who travels into space, including scientists, politicians, journalists, and tourists. Starting in the 1950s up until 2002, astronauts were sponsored and trained exclusively by governments, either by the military or by civilian space agencies. With the suborbital flight of the privately funded Spaceship One in 2004, a new category of astronaut was created, the commercial astronaut. Definition. The criteria for what constitutes human spaceflight vary. The FAR Copyright DAO Copyright Ration or Copyright Aéronautique Internationale Sporting Code for Astronautics recognizes only flights that exceed an altitude of 100 kilometers. In the United States, professional, military, and commercial astronauts who travel above an altitude of 50 miles are awarded astronaut wings. As of June 8, 2013, a total of 532 people from 36 countries have reached 100 km or more in altitude, of which 529 reached low Earth orbit or beyond. Of these, 24 people have traveled beyond low Earth orbit, to either lunar or translunar orbit or to the surface of the Moon. 3 of the 24 did so twice, Jim Lovell, John Young and Eugene Cernan. The 3 astronauts who have not reached low Earth orbit are spaceplane pilots Joe Walker, Mike Melville, and Brian Binnie. As of June 20, 2011, under the U.S. definition 538 people qualify as having reached space, above 50 miles altitude. Of 8 X-15 pilots who exceeded 50 miles in altitude, only 1 exceeded 100 kilometers. Space travelers have spent over 41,790 man-days in space, including over 100 astronaut days of spacewalks. As of 2008, the man with the longest cumulative time in space is Sergei K. Krikalev, who has spent 803 days, 9 hours and 39 minutes, or 2.2 years, in space. Peggy A. Whitson holds the record for the most time in space by a woman, 377 days. Terminology. English. In English-speaking nations, a professional space traveler is called an astronaut. The term derives from the Greek words astron, meaning star, and nauts, meaning sailor. The first known use of the term astronaut in the modern sense was by Neil R. Jones in his short story The Death's Head Meteor in 1930. The word itself had been known earlier. For example, in Percy Gregg's 1880 book Across the Zodiac, astronaut referred to a spacecraft. In Les Navigateurs d'Infini of J.H. Rosny or registered trademark NAR copyright, the word astronautique was used. The word may have been inspired by aeronaut, an older term for an air traveler first applied to balloonists. An early use in a non-fiction publication is Eric Frank Russell's poem The Astronaut in the November 1934 Bulletin of the British Interplanetary Society. The first known formal use of the term astronautics in the scientific community was the establishment of the annual International Astronautical Congress in 1950 and the subsequent founding of the International Astronautical Federation the following year. NASA applies the term astronaut to any crew member aboard NASA spacecraft bound for Earth orbit or beyond. NASA also uses the term as a title for those selected to join its astronaut corps. The European Space Agency similarly uses the term astronaut for members of its astronaut corps. Russian. By convention, an astronaut employed by the Russian Federal Space Agency is called a cosmonaut in English texts. The word is an anglicization of the Russian word cosmonaut, one who works in space outside the Earth's atmosphere, a space traveler, which derives from the Greek words kosmos, meaning universe, and nauts, meaning sailor. Other countries of the former Eastern Bloc use variations of the Russian word cosmonaut, such as the Polish kosmonauta. The Soviet Air Force pilot Yuri Gagarin was the first cosmonauta indeed the first persona in space. Valentina Tereshkova, a Russian factory worker, was the first woman in space, as well as arguably the second civilian to make it there. On March 14, 1995, Norman Thagard became the first American to ride to space on board a Russian launch vehicle, and thus became the first American cosmonaut. Chinese. Official English language texts issued by the government of China use astronaut, while texts in Russian use th 3/4 n th 1/4 th 3/4 th 1/2 th degree th squared n. In official Chinese language texts, ik hng is used for astronauts and cosmonauts, and hng is used for Chinese astronauts. The phrase hng copyright n is often used in Hong Kong and Taiwan. The term taikonaut is used by some English-language news media organizations for professional space travelers from China. The word has featured in the Longman and Oxford English dictionaries, the latter of which describes it as a hybrid of the Chinese term taikong and the Greek naut. The term became more common in 2003 when China sent its first astronaut Yang Liwei into space aboard the Shenzhou 5 spacecraft. This is the term used by Xinhua news agency in the English version of the Chinese People's Daily since the advent of the Chinese space program. The origin of the term is unclear. As early as May 1998, Xiao Liai from Malaysia used it in news groups. Other terms: with the rise of space tourism, NASA and the Russian Federal Space Agency agreed to use the term spaceflight participant to distinguish those space travelers from professional astronauts on missions coordinated by those two agencies. While no nation other than the Russian Federation, the United States, and China have launched a manned spacecraft, several other nations have sent people into space in cooperation with one of these countries. Inspired partly by these missions, other synonyms for astronaut have entered occasional English usage. For example, the term spationaut is sometimes used to describe French space travelers, from the Latin word spatium for space. The Malay term Angkasuan was used to describe participants in the Angkasuan program, and the Indian Space Research Organisation hoped to launch a spacecraft in 2018 that would carry Vuminauts, coined from the Sanskrit word for space. Space travel milestones. The first human in space was Soviet Yuri Gagarin, who was launched on April 12, 1961 aboard Vostok 1 and orbited around the Earth for 108 minutes. The first woman in space was Soviet Valentina Tereshkova, who launched on June 16, 1963 aboard Vostok 6 and orbited Earth for almost 3 days. Alan Shepard became the first American and second person in space on May 5, 1961 on a 15-minute suborbital flight. The first American woman in space was Sally Ride, during Space Shuttle Challenger's mission Street 7, on June 18, 1983. In 1992 Mae Jemison became the first African-American woman to travel in space aboard STS-47. Cosmonaut Alexei Leonov was the first person to conduct an extravehicular activity on March 18, 1965, on the Soviet Union's Voskhod 2 mission. This was followed 2.5 months later by astronaut Ed White, who made the first American EVA on NASA's Gemini 4 mission. The first manned mission to orbit the Moon, Apollo 8, included American William Anders, who was born in Hong Kong, making him the first Asian-born astronaut in 1968. In April 1985, Taylor Wang became the first ethnic Chinese person in space. On October 15, 2003, Yang Liwei became China's first astronaut on the Shenzhou 5 spacecraft. The Soviet Union, through its Interkosmos program, allowed people from other socialist countries to fly on its missions, with the notable exception of France participating in Soyuz TM-7. An example is Czechoslovak Vladimir Aremk, the first cosmonaut from a country other than the Soviet Union or the United States, who flew to space in 1978 on a Soyuz U rocket. On July 23, 1980, Pham Thien of Vietnam became the first Asian in space when he flew aboard Soyuz 37. Also in 1980, Cuban Arnaldo Tomeo Mar Copyrightendes became the first person of Hispanic and Black African descent to fly in space, and in 1983, Guyan Bluford became the first African American to fly into space. The first person born in Africa to fly in space was Patrick Baudry, in 1985. In 1985, Saudi Arabian Prince Sultan bin Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud became the first Arab Muslim astronaut in space. In 1988, Abdul Ahad Maman became the first Afghan to reach space, spending 9 days aboard the Mir space station. With the larger number of seats available on the Space Shuttle, the U.S. began taking international astronauts. In 1983, Wolfmar Bold of West Germany became the first non-U.S. citizen to fly in a U.S. spacecraft. In 1984, Marc Garneau became the first of 8 Canadian astronauts to fly in space. In 1985, Rodolfo Neri Vila became the first Mexican-born person in space. In 1991, Helen Sharman became the first Briton to fly in space. In 2002, Mark Shuttleworth became the first citizen of an African country to fly in space, as a paying spaceflight participant. In 2003, Ilan Ramon became the first Israeli to fly in space, although he died during a re-entry accident. Age milestones: the youngest person to fly in space is Aman Titov, who was 25 years old when he flew Vostok 2. The oldest person who has flown in space is John Glenn, who was 77 when he flew on STS-95. Duration and distance milestones: the longest stay in space thus far has been 438 days, by Russian Valery Polyakov. As of 2006, the most spaceflights by an individual astronaut is 7, a record held by both Jerry L. Ross and Franklin Chang Diaz. The farthest distance from Earth an astronaut has traveled was 401,056 km, when Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Haise went around the Moon during the Apollo 13 emergency. Civilian and non-government milestones: depending on the exact definition of civilian, the first civilian in space was either Valentina Tereshkova aboard Vostok 6 or Joseph Albert Walker on X-15 Flight 90 a month later. Tereshkova was only honorarily inducted into the USSR's Air Force, which had no female pilots whatsoever at that time. Joe Walker had joined the U.S. Army Air Force but was not a member during his flight. The first people in space who had never been a member of any country's armed forces were both Konstantin Feoktistov and Boris Yegorov aboard Voskhod 1. The first non-governmental space traveler was Byron K. Lichtenberg, a researcher from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology who flew on STS-9 in 1983. In December 1990, Toyohiro Akiyama became the first paying space traveler as a reporter for Tokyo Broadcasting System, a visit to Mir as part of an estimated $12 million deal with a Japanese TV station, although at the time, the term used to refer to Akiyama was research cosmonaut. Akiyama suffered severe space sickness during his mission, which affected his productivity. The first self-funded space tourist was Denis Tito on board the Russian spacecraft Soyuz TM-3 on April 28, 2001. Self-funded travelers. The first person to fly on an entirely privately funded mission was Mike Melville, piloting Spaceship One Flight 15P on a suborbital journey, although he was a test pilot employed by Scaled Composites and not an actual paying space tourist. 7 others have paid to fly into space: Denis Tito, April 28 May 6, 2001, Mark Shuttleworth, April 25 May 5, 2002, Gregory Olson, October 1 11, 2005, Anousheh Ansari, September 18 29, 2006, Charles Simonyi, April 7 21, 2007, March 26 April 8, 2009, Richard Garriott, October 12 24, 2008, Guy Lalibata. Copyright September 30, 2009 October 11, 2009. Training. The first NASA astronauts were selected for training in 1959. Early in the space program, military jet test piloting and engineering training were often cited as prerequisites for selection as an astronaut at NASA, although neither John Glenn nor Scott Carpenter had any university degree in engineering or any other discipline at the time of their selection. Selection was initially limited to military pilots. The earliest astronauts for both America and the USSR tended to be jet fighter pilots, and were often test pilots. Once selected, NASA astronauts go through 20 months of training in a variety of areas, including training for extravehicular activity in a facility such as NASA's Neutral Buoyancy Laboratory. Astronauts in training may also experience short periods of weightlessness in aircraft called the vomit comet, the nickname given to a pair of modified KC-135s which perform parabolic flights. Astronauts are also required to accumulate a number of flight hours in high-performance jet aircraft. This is mostly done in T-38 jet aircraft out of Ellington Field, due to its proximity to the Johnson Space Center. Ellington Field is also where the shuttle training aircraft is maintained and developed, although most flights of the aircraft are done out of Edwards Air Force Base. NASA candidacy requirements: be citizens of the United States. Pass a strict physical examination, and have a near and distant visual acuity correctable to 20/20. Blood pressure, while sitting, must be no greater than 140/90. Commander and pilot, a bachelor's degree in engineering, biological science, physical science or mathematics is required. At least 1,000 hours flying time as pilot in command in jet aircraft. Experience as a test pilot is desirable. Height must be 5 ft2 into 6 ft2 inches. Distant visual acuity must be correctable to 20/20 in each eye. The refractive surgical procedures of the eye, PRK and LASIK, are now allowed, providing at least 1 year has passed since the date of the procedure with no permanent adverse after effects. For those applicants under final consideration, an operative report on the surgical procedure will be requested. Mission Specialist, a bachelor's degree in engineering, biological science, physical science or mathematics, as well as at least 3 years of related professional experience and an advanced degree, such as a master's degree or a doctoral degree. Applicants' height must be between 4 ft 10.5 inches and 6 ft 4 in. Mission Specialist Educator. Applicants must have a bachelor's degree with teaching experience, including work at the kindergarten through 12th grade level. An advanced degree, such as a master's degree or a doctoral degree, is not required, but is strongly desired. Mission Specialist Educators, or Educator Astronauts, were first selected in 2004, and as of 2007, there are 3 NASA Educator Astronauts: Joseph M. McCarber, Richard Arnold, and Dorothy Metcalf Lindenberger. Barbara Morgan, selected as backup teacher to Krista McAuliffe in 1985, is considered to be the first educator astronaut by the media, but she trained as a mission specialist. The Educator Astronaut program is a successor to the Teacher in Space program from the 1980s. Health risks of space travel. Astronauts are susceptible to a variety of health risks including decompression sickness, barotrauma, immunodeficiencies, loss of bone and muscle, loss of eyesight, orthostatic intolerance, sleep disturbances, and radiation injury. A variety of large-scale medical studies are being conducted in space via the National Space and Biomedical Research Institute to address these issues. Prominent among these is the Advanced Diagnostic Ultrasound in Microgravity study, in which astronauts perform ultrasound scans under the guidance of remote experts to diagnose and potentially treat hundreds of medical conditions in space. This study's techniques are now being applied to cover professional and Olympic sports injuries as well as ultrasound performed by non-expert operators in medical and high school students. It is anticipated that remote-guided ultrasound will have application on Earth in emergency and rural care situations, where access to a trained physician is often rare. On December 31, 2012, a NASA-supported study reported that manned spaceflight may harm the brain and accelerate the onset of Alzheimer's disease. Food and drink. An astronaut on the International Space Station requires about 0.83 kilograms weight of food inclusive of food packaging, per meal each day. Longer duration missions require more food. Shuttle astronauts worked with nutritionists to select menus that appeal to their individual tastes. 5 months before flight, menus are selected and analyzed for nutritional content by the shuttle dietitian. Foods are tested to see how they will react in a reduced gravity environment. Caloric requirements are determined using a basal energy expenditure formula. On Earth, the average American uses about 35 gallons of water every day. On board the ISS, astronauts limit water use to only about 3 gallons per day. Insignia. In Russia, cosmonauts are awarded Pilot Cosmonaut to the Russian Federation upon completion of their missions. often accompanied with the award of Hero of the Russian Federation. This follows the practice established in the Soviet Union. At NASA, those who complete astronaut candidate training receive a silver lapel pin. Once they have flown in space, they receive a gold pin. U.S. astronauts who also have active duty military status receive a special qualification badge, known as the Astronaut Badge, after participation on a spaceflight. The United States Air Force also presents an astronaut badge to its pilots who exceed 50 miles in altitude. Deaths: 18 astronauts have lost their lives during 4 spaceflights. By nationality, 13 were American, 4 were Russian, and 1 was Israeli. 11 people have lost their lives training for spaceflight, 8 Americans and 3 Russians. 6 of these were in crashes of training jet aircraft, 1 drowned during water recovery training, and 4 were due to fires in pure oxygen environments. The Space Mirror Memorial, which stands on the grounds of the John F. Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex, commemorates the lives of the men and women who have died during spaceflight and during training in the space programs of the United States. In addition to 20 NASA career astronauts, the memorial includes the names of a U.S. Air Force X-15 test pilot, a U.S. Air Force officer who died while training for a then-classified military space program, and a civilian spaceflight participant. See also. References. External links: NASA, How to Become an Astronaut 101, List of International Partnership Organizations, Encyclopedia Astronautica, Phantom Cosmonauts, Collect Space, Astronaut Appearances Calendar, Spacefacts Der, Manned Astronautics, Facts and Figures, Astronaut Candidate Brochure Online, Tribute to Astronaut Neil Armstrong, Video Info.